Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're going to be talking all things traditional, conservative, European politics, England specifically. And with me to discuss that is the senior editor at the European Conservative, co-host of Deprogrammed at the New Culture Forum, and and sorry. Uh, and also host of the new podcast on the European Conservative, um, Forge. Welcome, Harrison Pitt.
Connor, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm very excited to deep dive into the things going on, as well as your journey to where you've gotten today, and what you see in the future. So, but let's start first. Big news came out yesterday. Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has called a general election in July. Harrison, why did he do this, and what was your first reaction?
My genuine first reaction, Connor, is that I think Rishi Sunak might have some kind of job opening in California, because there's a lot. I don't know if you know this, but there's a lot of talk in Britain about the fact that Rishi Sunak, I think he's a green card holder. He has strong ties in the United States, and his approach, his very technocratic approach to politics itself, is suggestive that he views himself as being a kind of CEO. He views being prime minister as something he can put on his CV and before he goes to work in Silicon Valley. My genuine first thought was that he might want to get his children into a Californian day school in time for the new year beginning in September. Genuinely, that was my first thought. There's very little political acumen at work in this decision. I think Nigel Farage himself was probably correct when he said on GB News yesterday, I think he was on GB News, took immediate reaction to the decision. He said that what Rishi Sunak's doing, if we're going to analyze it in political terms, and rather than focusing on California daycare timetables, that what he's trying to do is make. How did he put it? He said choosing suicide over obliteration, because I think there is a sense that support for the Conservative Party is hemorrhaging so much day by day that it would only have been worse if they'd pushed for an autumn, or, as you would put it, a fall election. And so I think that's why he's brought it nearer to damage limitation, and looking forward to his post-prime ministerial career probably on the other side of the Atlantic.
So he's basically cutting and running.
I think so. Yes.
Well,
yes, that's my view.
And things don't look good for the Conservative Party at all in the polls. So, and the longer he waits, it seems like it will probably continue to plummet. Or is he just thinking, at least from a political perspective, get it in as soon as possible before it plummets too far? Or is that part of it?
I think that's exactly it. And I also think another point that might be worth mentioning here is that the net immigration figures, which are published yearly by the Office for National Statistics in Britain, actually came out. What day is it today? Are we Thursday today? Yes, they actually came out today. And obviously that news, which is incredibly bad, I think so in Britain, just for an American audience, the general immigration is a very important issue in British politics. It has been, frankly, since the early 2000s. The main trends on immigration, net immigration into Britain in let's say the last 50 years of the 20th century, were on average roughly in the tens of thousands every year, and also predominantly first world European immigration into Britain. So it wasn't really a major issue that Callaghan and Thatcher and even really Major spoke about a great deal. It was with New Labour that you get immigration really shooting up into the hundreds of thousands. And the Tory promise, David Cameron's promise in 2010 as Prime Minister, is that he would restore those mid-20th century levels, bring immigration back into the tens of thousands. He failed. Immigration continued to be in the 200s of thousands, 300s of thousands. And post-Johnson, it has been nearing 780,000, 800,000. And the figures that came out, I think, were something like 645,000. So I think announcing the election was also a cynical ploy insofar as it distracted attention from yet another reminder of the nature of the Tories' betrayal on this really important fundamental demographic question that determines so much of politics. So I think that was very operative in his thinking as well. You've got the Rwanda. This concerns primarily illegal immigration into Britain. Rishi Sunak's policy on that front has been to try and create a credible deterrent by promising that, all illegal immigrants coming across the Channel from France would land themselves in Rwanda in any case, and therefore it was really pointless to make the trip. The only problem is that no flight has yet gone to Rwanda because it's been held up in court proceedings and all this sort of thing. And I think that he knew that this was going to be a very bad summer as well. Bear in mind that over the course of the summer, the numbers coming across the Channel goes up a great deal because it's better weather. It's much easier to get a dinghy across the Channel in July, which is when this election is going to be. I believe it's going to be July 4th, your national holiday. It's much more easy to get a boat across the Channel on July 4th than it is in November or whenever else it might be. So I think he wanted to cut short those headlines as well about, gosh, another 3,000 across the Channel today. And he's not going to be able to dodge all of it because, of course, we have all of June and a good bit of July, but he's going to avoid the really embarrassing July and August figures by it being in July 4th.
Gotcha. And it seems like he's also wants to take a boat he'll probably fly a private jet over the Atlantic after the election if things continue to go as poorly for him as they continue to seem to do.
Yes, that seems to be the case. It was a major problem in his leadership campaign when he was running against Truss, which got Liz Truss feels like quite a while ago at this point. I suppose that must have been August of 2022 or September of 2022, something like that. And many people were pointing out that, how rooted are you in this country? How invested are you in this country? Which is a very legitimate and fundamentally conservative question to ask. I mean, what is your stake in this society? And there are all sorts of ways in which dual loyalties, so to speak, can be important in politics. Obviously, it's a bit of a dirty word to talk about, but in Rishi Sunak's case, despite his ethnic Indian heritage, it's much more dual loyalties between California and Britain than between India and Britain. Because I think I view him as being a specific type of British Indian, a person who's fundamentally got a cosmopolitan outlook, and I'm much more concerned by his dual loyalty on that front than on the Indian front, in his case at least. Although I think it's legitimate to probe in that direction in other cases as well. And I don't think that we should fear accusations of bigotry or xenophobia for saying, when you have to stand up and really be counted Prime Minister, you're not just some businessman operating as some kind of metic in this country of ours, in this home of ours. Is this, when you have to stand up and be counted, what are you? Who are you? I think those are legitimate questions to ask. But in Rishi Sunak's case, it's too much fondness for Silicon Valley rather than too much fondness for Delhi that bothers me.
Yeah, and he's also Hindu, and Christianity has a very specific view on patriotism and loyalty to country. So there, being India's it's the main Hindu country in the world. So like, where does a Hindu loyalty lie when it comes to a Christian nation, or what's supposed to be a Christian nation like the UK? And of course, it's barely a Christian nation nowadays, but that's mostly because it's been subverted.
That is the case. I think so this is a good point, Connor. There are two ways. I would agree with you, but what I don't like, and I don't think you're doing this, but what people often do is that they mistake questions of values. They confuse questions of what are your values with what is your identity. And as far as I'm concerned, the identitarian question about who are you, what is your national identity or local identity or whatever it might be, is separate from questions of moral values. And I think that both are legitimate questions to ask when it comes to any prospective immigrant, not just what is your primary source of loyalty in terms of identity, but also what is your primary source of loyalty in terms of a moral framework. And nations need both. It's not enough. I think too much. One of the tendencies that both secular civic nationalists and Christian or theologized versions of civic nationalists have is a tendency to define nations purely in terms of a bundle of values, whereas I view nations as something much more like an organism, and that organism is subject to shifts in its collective values over time. And a good way of illustrating this is, and this I suppose this has a bearing on both questions, is that often today in Britain, I imagine it's probably slightly similar in America, although you have your constitution, which makes it a little bit easier to define what it is to be an American. There is a kind of propositional aspect to being an American, precisely because of the importance of the Constitution, not least for conservatives in your country. But in Britain, there's a tendency today, and I think it's been there ever since David Cameron, to say, being British is about, and you just list a bunch of shallow anodyne values. Or being British is about believing in being nice to people and being in favor of gay marriage and all of these sorts of things. And it's very, very thin stuff. And even if it's slightly stronger, if they say things like Britain is about believing in democracy or believing in toleration, I'm not necessarily against either of those things. But the fact is that Fortescue, who was British, or he was English at any rate, living in the 15th century, didn't believe in any of those things. And so by not believing in those things, does that make him any less British? Does that make him less English or less British than, say, a Nigerian person who does believe in those two things today? That in itself is a good test case for demonstrating the difference between what is your identity, which is going to be bound up in a shared history, shared heritage, shared experiences, over which values and ideas can differ, or what is your value system today? What is the value system that informs the moral fabric of that society? And I'm in favor of keeping these questions separate. And I think that civic nationalists, both secular civic nationalists and theologized versions of civic nationalism, align them in ways which I think are confusing and lead to very counterintuitive results, as you can see with my case of Fortescue. I mean, is he not English because he doesn't believe in gay marriage and tolerance and democracy? I think he's still English, and I don't think that those are the determinant of belonging.
Yeah, you mentioned that you see society as basically an organism. Well, it's also very much like, I mean, broaden, build an organism into a person. You see that societies are made up of humans. And what is the composite of a human? A human is a body and a soul. So, something can't just be purely genetics, but it also it has a theological metaphysic component to it that needs to be taken into account all at the same time.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think one of the weaknesses in secular liberalism is that what it usually has is a kind of political theology without realizing it. At least in the past, this would be articulated in a rather unashamed way. Whereas precisely because modern secular liberals regard themselves as downstream of those sorts of questions, they regard those as obsolete. It means that they are not sufficiently self-critical about the presuppositions which inform their politics, both presuppositions at the level of identity, what is the human person, and presuppositions at the level of what is his moral calling, what is he called to, what is his telos, what is his direction. And these are both questions which are impossible to ignore in politics as in any other domain. And I'd actually rather a political theology were explicitly anti-theological, as opposed to just saying, "Oh no, we're down. We don't," which is in a way is a strange kind of theological commitment to be anti-theological, because you're saying at least you're conceding that these questions matter, I suppose, is what I'm saying. But there's a complacency in the secular liberal mind which prevents them from recognizing this and from grappling with their presuppositions, both moral and to do with what is the nation itself, what is the human person who comprises that nation.
Indeed. And Rishi Sunak has basically detached himself from the nation in lots of ways, in in who he prioritizes, who he's working for, and it doesn't seem to be for the members of the UK, or for the English, for the Scottish, for the Northern Irish, for the Welsh. Those people don't come into his equation. Now, Nigel Farage had been seen as sort of somewhat of a hopeful figure regarding British politics. And he has come out and said he is not going to stand for Parliament with the Reform Party, even though he supports them, but he's not willing to basically stake his a victory or no victory on it. He's not. It's, in other words, he doesn't want to be either humiliated or or he doesn't think they're necessarily going to succeed. I don't know what he wants to achieve here, but he finds way more importance in America, which I find kind of bizarre. So, what do you make of that?
Yes, he's almost guilty of the same thing I was just accusing Rishi
Yeah.
Sunak of. Although I'd like to think that his pro-Americanism is a little bit more heroic and a little less acquisitive, in the sense that he, I think, really does love your country for what it is, and for its traditions, and for its and its people. So I wouldn't want to accuse Farage of being some kind of venal Silicon Valley, looking for cash, or looking for aplomb in that very dull, anti-American, frankly, cosmopolitan universe that seems to exist in San Francisco. But yes, there are a number of views you could take of this. There's the strategic one, that namely Farage knows that, given the fact that this election is going to be in about 6 weeks' time, he's going to have very little. I mean, he might be able to win a seat for himself, but it would be a Pyrrhic victory, so to speak, in that a Labour government at this point is all but guaranteed, frankly. And that's why I said at the beginning, it's for Sunak, it's a question of committing suicide at this point, rather than just being completely eliminated later down the line. You might be able to limit some of the damage by holding it in July, as opposed to later in the year. And I think Farage thinks that there's only so much that he, on a national level, maybe he would win a seat, maybe he'd end up getting a safe seat for Reform in a place like Clacton in Essex, where I think he tried to run there in 2016. He probably would win that today. But what would be the point in being in Parliament? He'd be more influential at Donald Trump's right-hand side. I think he might have his eye more on 2029 than on 2024. I certainly don't, and I think he's probably right about that. I don't think that this year is going to be our annus mirabilis. I think if we're lucky enough to have one, it will be 2029, or perhaps even 2034. So there's the charitable explanation on that front. The less charitable one is that he's bored with politics, which is possible. He's certainly very, very disillusioned with the political system, including our voting system, which doesn't benefit smaller parties like Reform. The two parties, due to our first past the post system, have a very, very strong stranglehold over electoral politics. And whereas on the continent, they're having more proportional representation systems, there's much more ability for a party like Alternative for Deutschland just to really gather steam, or the Sweden Democrats really to gather steam. In British politics, in order to pull off a coup like that, it is a sort of once in a century event. So you have the Labour Party overtaking the Liberals in the 1910s and 1920s. But it really is I don't think, and I think Farage calculated correctly that was not going to happen this year, certainly not in 6 weeks.
Is for Nigel Farage's ascent to power, basically in a future election, is it necessary for the Conservative Party to get 0 seats this election?
That would be a good outcome in any case, regardless of what it meant for Farage's future career, because it really would send a message of a kind that needs to be sent about frankly, the extent of their betrayal, since winning on a fundamentally what we might want to call a nationally conservative prospectus in 2019, which is what the manifesto was. And many of the people who are spearheading Boris Johnson, not least, but also Michael Gove, don't sign up to any of that sort of thing. And Rishi Sunak too, for that matter. These people are globalist drones, frankly. But I think, yes, I think Farage, I think Farage knew that this was not going to be his time, and I think that he knew that the extent of the conservative wipeout wouldn't be, he wouldn't be the chief beneficiary of that in 2024. He may be in 2029, and I do think that if Farage is going to have a successful political career, continue in having a successful political career in Britain beyond this next election, it will, the destruction of the Conservative Party will almost certainly have to be a prerequisite for that, unless, and there's some talk about this, I somewhat doubt it myself, given how much he despises the Conservative Party. There's talk of him, saving them, stepping in after the deluge and saying, well, I was right all along. Why didn't you let me lead you into 2029? I wonder whether that will work. For one particular reason, it's the parliamentary Conservative Party. So in other words, the MPs who have actually won their seats, who've kept their seats, who will have the main. So our primary system is very different from the Republican primary system in that, and I'm talking about getting Conservative leaders here. So let's say that the Conservative Party is completely wiped out in there's just a parliamentary rump of 100 of them left in Parliament, okay? And all of a sudden they're thinking, gosh, what is our direction now? Who is our leader going to be? Now, there are some people saying, well, maybe Farage will step in at that moment and say, gosh, you make me leader. The problem is that whereas he would have the overwhelming support of the Conservative base, the people who are, card-carrying members of the Conservative Party, the base is not king in internal Conservative Party electoral politics in the way that they are in the United States. What happens is that the parliamentary party whittles down 2 candidates and then puts it to the base. And by that point, all of the most energetic, principled people have been carefully selected out. Anyway, that's why we ended up with Sunak versus Truss last time. So yeah, there wouldn't be any chance of a kind of Trumpian takeover. A Trumpian takeover or a Faragean takeover of the British Conservative Party is much harder because of for reasons to do with the Conservative Party's own internal processes.
Does Nigel Farage's love of America concern you at all regarding sort of liberalism? America is a country built on liberalism. Is Farage's love of America make him sort of too liberal to actually lead a right-wing movement that's capable of fixing the real problems in the society?
That's an excellent question. I don't think that Farage is perfect. I think that even if he were to be prime minister and were to make good on all of his promises, particularly around immigration, that would not. I don't think that would magically avert or reverse our civilizational crisis on a whole host of issues. In fact, I don't think that politics can do that. I think that if you're looking for rejuvenation at the political level, that is incipiently dangerous and has a tendency towards totalitarianism, and B, you're neglecting the fact that politics is downstream of culture, and politics is downstream of spiritual trends as well. I would say. Now, that's not to say that politics is therefore unimportant to the person who cares about our civilizational crisis. There are better people to have at the helm and worse people to have at the helm, but I don't think that politics can itself avert that. And I wouldn't want to burden Farage with the supposition that he would be able to do that. As for your point about liberalism, I think that his attachment to liberalism, such as it is, and it's clearly quite strong in the economic domain, and it is for most Anglo-American conservatives. I mean, it's almost, it's one of the main bullet points. We believe in free markets and free trade and deregulation, and and not all of that is completely to be scoffed at. But I think that the main question that I have for politicians in the modern world when they are sounding a little bit too liberal is, what is your liberalism constrained by? In other words, you have a concern for freedom. Okay, no one is particularly anti-freedom. No one says I don't like freedom. That's not something you encounter. So the thing that I'm interested in is, what is your love of freedom constrained by? And if it's constrained by a genuine attachment to the nation and to the community and local communities, as well as the broader national community that resides within that nation, I don't regard a commitment to lowering taxes or a commitment to hating taxes, as your founders did, as particularly threatening in and of itself.
Well, I have to say, our founders didn't exactly hate taxes. They were the ones who were taxing us when they brought about the revolution. They were already taxing us much higher than we were being taxed by the crown. So
I'm so glad to hear an American say that. I didn't think I'd get away with it, but since if you're going to say it, I may as well agree.
I'm not too much of a fan of our founders, so I don't want a country based on liberalism. So that's makes me predisposed to dislike my founding fathers. But there's more than just political philosophy that you can find good in a country, and patriotism, or reason to be patriotic for.
No, that's very true. I have more sympathy with your founders than you do, I must say. And I'm not sure whether I would, unless it's a matter of nomenclature, I don't think I would call them liberals in the way that is necessarily understood by that. I mean, clearly there's a concern for liberty there, and there's a concern for carving out space for the individual to enjoy certain basic freedoms. But my own view is that their liberalism, if we want to call it that, or their proto-liberalism, or whatever fancy word we want to use, is, as I say, sufficiently constrained by other concerns. And you have all of the talk about this. There's an understanding in fact, among the best of them, particularly in the Federalist Papers, that in the same way, exactly what you just said, if you're looking for redemption, and if you're looking for high spiritual insight or moral insight in political philosophy, you're probably looking in the wrong place. There are all sorts of things which make that kind of constitution possible that the founders would have been very keen to preserve. And I think is it John Adams who says this constitution was never framed for an irreligious people. It's only for a religious and moral people, and it's not fit for the governance of any other. And so I think that there is an understanding of the importance of religion as a publicly honored system of belief and a system of practices, and which infuses the national community and makes them fit to enjoy precisely the sort of freedoms that the Constitution tries to entrench for them.
Okay, well, there's two things, in my opinion, that sort of go off of that I think John Adams is forgetting an element there, or not really forgetting. He wouldn't have believed this, but that a constitution, the Constitution may have been made for some religious people, but it wasn't made in a way that could maintain a religious people, or secure a religious people. It wasn't a religious oriented society. Like, the Constitution wasn't set up that way in order to flourish, or allow religion to flourish, at least true religion. And then another aspect is that what was it? I forgot what I was going to say. Anyways, so the point is that religion wasn't maintained by the Constitution, so it was immediately falls apart after you lose a religious people.
Completely. And I think that the founders, well, I can't speak unanimously for all of them. Probably dangerous even to try and speak for any of them, but I think they would have granted that and they would have accepted that. But it goes back to what I was saying and what you were agreeing with earlier, what you said yourself earlier, is that to expect a legalistic framework to hold what you call true religion in place is itself a bit of a quixotic move. That's not how these sorts of things work. And I think it would be expecting too much of any constitution, even if it was much more explicitly Christian. I don't think that would have been enough to hold American Christianity together. Politics and law are downstream from culture, and if at the level of culture there is a complete collapse in religious belief, then of course, yes, that's going to be the case. But I think that would have been the case even if the Constitution had been much more avowedly and doggedly Christian. And so I think it's more that they understood that Christianity, at the time at least, or widespread Christian belief, could be taken for granted, and therefore the Constitution is fit, and therefore the Constitution works in that context. But if there's an admission there that it will cease to work in different contexts, and so for me that's just an argument for fighting for those contexts, so to speak, fighting for that, fighting for religion at the cultural level, rather than let's try and insert a constitutional amendment saying everyone has to, that I don't think that is going to keep true Christian belief preserved.
I don't think the Constitution would be able to do that. Like, I don't think there's anything. I don't think anything written, I guess, could do that. But I don't think republicanism, like, I don't think a Republican government can maintain a religious people. As well as what I was thinking about that I forgot was that I'm not really sure what liberties Americans gained from the American Revolution that English didn't already have, more or less. I mean, the most you could say is Catholics were freed, and that's about it. That's the main difference, and that's only because of the allies of Spain and France, not because of any love of Catholics amongst Americans.
Yeah, no, I agree. Quite the contrary, in fact. I mean, one of the things, as I understand it, which made the predominantly Protestant population of the 13 colonies very keen to enlist to fight against the British was a completely mistaken rumor that George III, it's just a slander, that George III was a closet Catholic, and through the Quebec Act of, I think, 1775, was embarked on a malicious popish project to turn these solidly Protestant 13 colonies, to impose papist absolutism on them. And so there was clear that's true what you say, and the later alliance with France and Spain was decisive in making sure that the First Amendment applied not only to competing Protestant sects but also to Catholics. And but there were one or two Catholics who signed the Constitution in 1787 as well. That's true. And you're not going to get me defending the American Revolution, Connor. I think that there were all sorts of things that are all sort of things that were wrong about it. And for anyone who's interested, you probably read it yourself. You may have read it yourself in a contemporary, sort of pro-British Tory perspective of that revolution. They should read Andrew Roberts' masterful biography of George III, which goes into it in some detail. And Roberts, like me, has some respect for your founding fathers as well. But one thing I would agree with, there's certainly what I don't like is the kind of secular mythology around the founding fathers, the almost neo-pagan secular mythology around the founding fathers that has kicked in on the American right. And I think that in the last 50 to 60 years or so, and I think that is probably related to the decline in Christianity. In other words, if you can't appeal to the Bible, appeal to Jefferson or appeal to Washington. And I think that's become probably more of a problem in American culture. But yes, you did enjoy all sorts of rights as Englishmen, and a lot of the propaganda around certain taxes we wanted to put on you. It was only because we bloody won the 7 Years' War on your behalf that we that we that we felt it might not be unreasonable for you to pay for your own defense. Anyway, let's not rehash the 1760s and 1770s.
Well, it's not like it'd be a fight or anything. You'd just be saying things, and I'd be like, yep, agreed. If another book I'd encourage people to read is Puritan's Empire by Charles Coulomb, is also a very good, maybe both English, perspective as well as an American perspective. Gives sort of a balance there. But anyway, so there's that. But yeah, we're not going to be rehashing the American Revolution by any stretch. But anyway, so back to sort of the European theater, so to speak. I thought a while back that Farage would sort of represent sort of the right wing version of maybe of Gert Velder's, in the Netherlands, the AFD in Germany, something like that. But it seems like because of the system in Britain, it's much harder to do that, as you said. But the other European countries or European Union members are faring much better with that. So, what do you think about the sort of rise of alternative right-wing parties?
Well, I feel incredibly jealous, of course. It's a horrific irony as well, in that, we were supposed to be leading this populist revolution by getting Brexit going in 2016, and we were supposed to be the kingmakers when it came to right-wing populist politics in the European continent, and we're lagging hopelessly behind. And I actually think that these two things are related. And it pains me to say it as someone who, in principle, is a radical, well, not radical, but in principle, in constitution, as a matter of constitutional principle, I am in favor of leaving the European Union. I think that the European Communities Act of 1972, which is the really important bit of legislation in European. Some people talk about the Maastricht Treaty, and that is important. It expanded the reach of the European Union. But 1972 European Communities Act is what both Enoch Powell on the right and Tony Benn and I think Michael Foot as well, actually, on the left were against in the 1970s, because what that single act did, and its consequences were not too apparent in 1972, but what it did is it asserted that all European regulations and directives will take precedence over those passed by Parliament. And so that was the supranational mechanism which ensured Parliament's handing over of its own powers to a foreign entity. And now, obviously, over time, throughout history, that matters more and more, because if that entity takes on more, remits unto itself, then that principle is going to have more consequences in the real world. But the principle itself is disgraceful. So constitutionally, I'm a Brexiteer through and through. However, I do think that it has radically, given the contingencies of our historical circumstances in Britain, I think it has, in fact, radically delayed the arrival of anything approaching serious political right-wing populism. And I think it's done that by throwing a lifeline to a wretched Conservative Party that basically reinterpreted Brexit for its own reasons. And people like Johnson and Gove and Rishi Sunak, as I said earlier, these people are all Brexiteers. They were all Brexiteers in 2016, but they weren't Brexiteers for the same reason as someone like Nigel Farage or like me. They were Brexiteers because they thought that the European Union was insufficiently globalist, so to speak. They thought it was too regional, and that we wanted global Britain. And what we've got as a result of that is much higher immigration post-Brexit, because these people were put in charge of it, and they interpreted it in globalist terms. And we've got much higher immigration from parts of the world which are much less culturally compatible than was the case when we were members of the European Union. And so there's been I feel very I actually sometimes wonder whether Brexit was the right option. In principle, I think it is, but given the political dispensation in Westminster and given the people who would inevitably lead it, was it, in pragmatic terms, if not in philosophical ones, a bad option to pursue? Because all we've done now is radically tilted our immigration system, which before, as I say, was already one of the leading issues which led to Brexit being passed in the first place. All we've done is the numbers have radically gone up, and instead of being Germans and Frenchmen and Poles who are much more likely to return to their own countries at some point in the future, they're much more likely to make a net fiscal contribution to the British Exchequer, and they have no incentive whatsoever to support anti-white identity politics. Instead of that, we've had loads of Nigerians, loads of Indians, loads of Bangladeshis, and so the compositional aspect of our immigration system has become even more lamentable post-Brexit, and I think that was actually predictable in advance, and it's a great shame.
Is this sort of the leaving of the European Union just attached you guys greater to the American global empire?
Yeah, I don't know if I put it in those terms. I don't disagree. I just have to think about it a bit more. Is it because I don't view it as an American? I suppose. I mean, I suppose so. I suppose understood broadly that probably is true. But as I say, I do think that I don't think of Johnson and Gove and Sunak, the triumvirate that I keep mentioning as being the globalist Brexiteers. I don't think of these people as working at the behest of the State Department so much. Although obviously
Could it be
I know
a
you're not
little?
saying that.
Sorry, could it be more complicated in the sense of the global American empire, in some sense, is more headquartered in California and New York, in some ways, more so than it is in Washington, D.C., though it is it's obviously dominant there too. But you said Sunak is more or less, would be interested in going to California after losing an election.
Yeah, no, I was not attributing that perspective to you, that you thought that these people were secret plants on behalf of the State Department. I'm sure you don't think that. But I think you're right, that would be a better way of putting it. It's more that they share an outlook with the kind of people who do lead what we might call the great American empire. But I do think they sincerely hold those perspectives. God knows why they do, but I think they genuinely do hold those perspectives. And yeah, what has happened is that a roar in 2016 for British nationalism, or for some kind of British nationalism, has been interpreted by our elite as a clamor for more globalism, and they've duly given it to us, and they're going to get punished for it.
Yes, and they're just going right into the Labour Party's hands.
Yeah, so this is another problem. There's no obvious political vehicle for people who think in the same way that you and I do, Connor, in Britain at the moment, and this is not going to be. Whereas I'm sure many people in America are very enthusiastic about the chance of making up for the last 4 years in November by electing Trump. I am not going into this election with any kind of excitement. The predominant emotion here isn't, I think, what did he once say? It wasn't vengeance, was it? He said, "What I want is just vengeance," or
I don't know.
that he used a word which was typically good campaigning. No one's feeling. I get the sense that Trump world is incredibly excited to go to the polls in November. No one in Britain is excited by Keir Starmer, so it's not that kind of situation where people are clamoring to go and vote. The predominant emotion in this country is not enthusiasm for one side or for another side. It is, frankly, boredom and apathy.
Yes, I mean, I think also in America, the the populace is enthusiastic, but I don't think people are like more like politically focused, like right wingers, are necessarily as excited about Trump. Like, I don't think that Trump's going to solve much necessarily in his election. If anything, if Trump gets elected, which is not a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination, I think that he might be a band-aid, and that band-aid is just, going to make people feel good for a while, which I think is the one of the main problems with populism. But also to add the fact that you have to rely on representatives and senators in DC who are basically owned. They're basically bought by somebody, and they're not going to. The only thing they agree on together are the worst decisions you could possibly make, and they usually involve giving people our money. So I don't see how Trump is really going to change that.
Yes, I think he will certainly have, and if he does win, I think he'll have a serious uphill battle on his hands. And the main question, I think you're right. There's definitely a distinction between the enthusiastic base and the more politically savvy right wing elites who realize that this is going to be a difficult undertaking for him to take on the deep state and make sure he doesn't make all of the mistakes he clearly made last time in appointing people who then agitated against his own interests. But there is nevertheless, and this is where I'm jealous of the United States as well as being jealous of certain European developments, it's not so much that Trump is perfect, he really isn't. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. The West's problems and Britain's problems and America's problems are so much deeper than just, what is the reigning mentality in the Republican Party today, or what is, what's going to happen in this by-election, what's going to happen in this gubernatorial race. I mean, the crisis is much deeper than that, and I don't think politics is up to the task. It can definitely make things better and make things worse, but I don't think it's up to the task of solving it. I think that to say that would be to adopt a kind of Caesar or papist perspective on things, which I'm not sure is the right tack at this moment in time. Yes, I think, but the point is, nevertheless, that there is at least the beginnings of the nucleus in the United States. There's a feeling that there is the nucleus of a political movement that is, maybe it will fail, maybe it will succeed, but it has a sense of what needs to be done at the political level, what can be done at the political level, and people are excited about it, and people are, really devoted to it. And here, that nothing could be further from the reigning emotional mentality about politics here in Britain. Like, people like me and everyone else on the right in British politics is radically disillusioned with the political dispensation we have at Westminster. And I think that's partly why today I know a lot of people who are very frustrated, in fact, and feeling very miffed about Farage's decision, and I can understand that. Although again, it goes back to that question of whether he would have been able to make a difference this time around anyway, in practical terms.
Is he planning the long game too?
I think if I had to guess, I think that I wrote a piece. If I wrote a piece, which I wouldn't necessarily hold to all of it, about 4 or 5 months ago, with the rather pompous title. What was it? Après le déluge, moi. It was a play on the famous line by Louis XIV when he said "Après moi le déluge," and for people whose French is a bit off, it means after me the deluge. Everything's going to go wrong once I die, is what Louis XIV was saying. Because there's long reign, and he almost embodied political stability in France in the 17th century, something that they hadn't enjoyed prior to his rise to the throne. In Farage's context, it's not so much after the deluge, after me the deluge, so much as after the deluge me. In other words, once the Conservatives lose and once the flood happens, I'm going to pose as a credible leader of theirs. And I wonder if he might do that. But I think he's also probably, I don't think he has a fixed plan at the moment. It would be foolish to come up with too fixed a plan in British politics, because the Conservative Party brand is already, really, 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 really toxic in the public mind. There are all sorts of albatrosses around their necks. He might just think, well, much better to set up a startup party, or to galvanize reform post-election, or just. I think we're living through a time of political ferment, extreme political ferment in Britain. We're at one of those once-in-a-century periods in which there is the genuine possibility that a party that's been formally in place since the 1830s could completely collapse into smithereens, and some new phoenix can arise from the ashes. And I don't think that Farage, if he does envision a role in British politics in the future, I think he's just biding his time. But I think he just knows that now is not that time. But I don't think he has a completely concrete, worked out strategy about what he will do yet. And there are a number of options open to him, or indeed he might just want to make money in the United States and be a broadcaster on Fox or on Newsmax or whatever it might be. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we've talked about sort of the political situation, but what would you put as the most important issues that could actually turn around, our Western nations, our remnants of Christendom? What are the actual political issues that political parties, or even just people in their daily lives, should be putting into practice?
Well, since you mentioned Christendom, I will give a slightly different answer to the one I would have done if you hadn't. The answer that I give most of the time is immigration, and the reason why I give that as an answer is because I view demographic revolution, which is basically what we're living through, a wholesale demographic transformation, which is unprecedented in human history. That's the case both for your country, since the Immigration Act of 1965, and in Europe for the last 20 to 30 years. I think that if there's one point I could get across on this demographic point, is that conservatives like us, we readily understand Burkean wisdom when it's applied to constitutional matters. Well, don't fiddle with that constitution because there might be all sorts of unintended consequences. You're neglecting the inherent practical accumulated wisdom that's built into long established arrangements, and you're assuming that a single mind is going to be better at grasping political reality than a whole intergenerational project, and it's therefore very unwise to tinker with an organic constitution. You might end up killing it, and everyone might be worse off as a result. So Burkean conservatives readily understand that whether we're talking about aristocratic titles or whether we're talking about the economy, that we don't want a centrally planned economy, because wisdom dispersed in the free transactions of individual agents pursuing their own interest there is in a centrally planned system, no matter how intelligent the planner is. All of this stuff that we readily understand as conservatives. Demographic revolution is much more insidious than economic revolution or constitutional revolution, because almost by definition, demographic revolutions are irreversible. The Hungarians embarked on because of Soviet domination, they were the victims, let's put it that way, of a very vicious social, cultural, and economic revolution from the 1950s until 1991. But the Hungarian people, at least, still existed at the end of the process, and they could assess that, and they could change things. At the end of a demographic revolution, it's irreversible because the people don't exist anymore, and it's just done. And so that's on a kind of secular basis, I view immigration as the most important issue for conservatives to wrestle with. But because you mentioned the importance of Christianity in our public life, I would say something much more like, and it ties into the immigration question as well, the need to support families and the need to encourage a boost in the birth rate. Because this goes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't think that politics can solve issues of which are fundamentally spiritual and religious and moral and cultural. I don't think, but they can make things better and they can make things worse. And using what political power we might have as conservatives to try and ensure healthy morally ordered family formation, it is never a bad thing to be pursuing, and making sure that parents have as much in the way of parental rights over the education of their own children, rather than giving them if you're not, ask parents, if parents get about 10 to 15 minutes, if they have lots of children. I'm from a big family, I'm from a family of 6. Parents have 10, 15 minutes one-on-one time with their children each day. TikTok's getting much more time with your children than you are, and that's as true of state education as well. And there's also which is being peddled both in American schools and British schools. And so if we're talking about a kind of Christian revival, then I think that what we should be focusing on politically is pronatalism and parental rights.
Would pronatalism involve ending abortion?
Yes.
Okay.
Certainly. But the reason I didn't mention that, if I may say, sorry, the reason I didn't mention that is not because I don't hold the same view as you do, and it's because abortion is a much less salient political issue in Britain than it is in the United States. And so it's a little bit off the radar. I mean, it's not that I don't care about it. I care about it an immense deal. And I know I'm a member of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, which is our version, I suppose, of live action. Is that that's Lila Rose's thing in the States, live action. We have that here.
We have a lot more groups. But there's no one pro-life group really in America. There's a lot of them.
Yeah. Yes, but no, it's very important. But in the British context, alas, tragically, just very little political purchase, and you would not have been able to get anything like the Dobbs decision, and you wouldn't have had the Federalist Society and all of these are equivalents of the Federalist Society and the, I don't know, whatever, all of the American organizations which were angling for decades for a reversal of Roe. You wouldn't have been able to have that kind of enthusiasm going on abortion, on pro-life matters in Britain, and I think that's actually partly because our abortion law was passed by Parliament in the first place, and so there wasn't this feeling that it had been unjust. It was, legalized by a judicial backdoor in the case of Roe in very dubious constitutional circumstances. It actually, there was the feeling of injustice on the part of American conservatives, as well as their greater Christian commitment, made it more important for the evangelical and other conservative movements in America than it is here. So that's why I didn't mention it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. You keep separating sort of secular and religious, which, I mean, they're there for those distinctions, of course. But from what I understand, the reason secular even exists in the world is because the church, the Catholic Church, basically had two sets of sort of levels to society. One was the clerical, and one was the secular. But the secular didn't actually involve any less religion. So how is religion not part of the secular domain? I mean, you even live in a country with a state religion.
Absolutely. And when I use the word secular, I don't mean thereby religious commitments or religious perspectives on the secular are therefore discounted at the outset. I think that you're right today that there is a misunderstanding of that. The word secular as meaning explicitly non-religious, or we have a neutral, secular, liberal public square in which a religion is sort of cordoned off to the margins of private life. When I use the word secular, I think it's impossible to engage in what I'm calling what is properly understood as secular politics without an understanding of the sacred. But keeping them separate is also important. Otherwise, you're going to be liable to thinking that politics itself is a kind of sacred pursuit. And I would say that I don't think politics is a sacred pursuit. I think it is a pursuit which can be informed by an understanding of the sacred, but it is precisely the sacred that keeps the secular secular. And we're dealing with fallen creatures here, and the political realm is not going to be sacred in the way that in the way that the church isn't going to be sacred either all of the time, or its hierarchy isn't going to be. You know what I mean? There is a proper distinction between.
You mean the physical? You mean the people within the church, not the church itself, right?
That's exactly what I mean. Yes.
Okay. Just good to get those distinctions. Well, the reason I mentioned this is secular, because to me it seemed when I asked the question about what we should be doing, you separated the two into sort of immigration and pro-natalist policies into basically two categories, which to me, I thought you were using secular to meaning using secular the way I was thinking you were using it. That's the reason I asked that.
Let me clarify then. I view immigration as an issue which should be approached from a Christian perspective. And one of the pieces of which I'm most proud, because I spent ages writing it and I felt it was thoroughly important, was one called "Can a Christian Care About Demographics?" Because there is this belief that, well, if we're Christians, are we allowed to care more for our own people as opposed to other people? Are we not neglecting our duties to the stranger? And there's a lot, I find personally, that there's a lot of complacency in Christian circles on the question of immigration. So I wanted to, and I'm perfectly happy to engage on that issue in a Christian context. And my answer to the question, can a Christian care about demographics, was yes. And I made both a theological and a biblical argument for that. The reason why I separated them out on that particular, because I don't, when I mentioned, the secular matter of immigration, and then you've got the more, when we're talking about Christendom, I would emphasize pronatalism and, of course, pro-life activism and parental choice in education. The reason why I separate, because immigration is much less obviously a question with a bearing, which Christianity can inform in most people's minds, because it's usually debated in terms that are either concerning to some modern day Christians, or it's debated in logistical terms about net fiscal contributions and all that. But obviously all of this is, I think that an understanding of moral life, a collective understanding of moral life, is always going to supervene all of our pragmatic and practical discussions, including about pensions. I never think that religion should be I don't think it's possible for religion ever to be completely out of the picture. But it's less obvious in the case of immigration. And I also encounter a lot of Christians, and I really don't like this. I encounter a lot of Christians who will say things like, well, the Catholic Church is really suffering in Britain because, white British people aren't going to church. So we just import loads of Rwandans and Filipinos. And it's like, if you're doing that, and this is the point I make in my piece, because a lot of Christians are in favor of lots of immigration precisely because they have this idea that it reinvigorates communities and this idea that it actually makes us a more religious culture. I don't think it makes us a more religious culture. I think it replaces our culture with a different religious culture. I think that's what it's doing. And I think that the Great Commission in Matthew is to make disciples of all nations. It's not replace increasingly paganizing nations with less pagan nations. That's not what it says.
Yeah, it's not to bring all nations to make one nation. Yeah.
That's another reason why I think. Am I still muted?
No, you're good. Sorry.
That's another reason why I kept them a little bit separate, is because I in the back of my mind I had this. There is this. I don't think. Put it this way. If we avert this demographic crisis, this demographic revolution, this demographic transformation, if we avert it, I don't think that automatically brings Christendom back. And that was the framing of the question. I think that there's another fight to have, but I certainly don't think that it's a Christian thing to effectively replace, and this is a bit of a controversial term, but I think it's legitimate and I think it's accurate. I don't think it's a Christian to replace a settled people with another people without their consent, and they'd be mad to give their consent as well, which is another consideration.
is kind of like repelling an invasion. Yes, we need to be doing all the religious, worship of God, true religion. We need to be a Christian people, but at the same time, there's an army at the gates, and we need to take care of that problem as well.
Absolutely. And the other thing as well, it's in a way, it's not worse in terms of blood and in terms of bloodshed as armed conquest, but I call it, I like to call it unarmed demographic conquest. And one of the reasons why that's more insidious, even though it's less bloody, is because when there's a full-on army, an actual army outside the gates, then presumably your own political elite might be on your side in wanting to fight them. But
That's a
when it's
presumption.
happening through an insidious,
Sorry, I just want to add that that's a presumption that I don't think you can have in any of our countries these days. Like,
there is that consideration. Maybe they're so venal they wouldn't even be willing to fight that. But there's still an understanding. I mean, I suspect if Putin were to, I don't think he ever would, but if Putin were to try and launch an invasion of Britain, I do think that you would get, or even Pakistan, if you want to make it a non-white country, would do something like that in Britain. I think you'd still. I think the clamour for repelling the invasion would be so irresistible that even if they didn't really believe in it, the elites would probably agree to fight it. But but when it's unarmed demographic conquest, the consequences are not immediately obvious. It's not like the Vikings were at the gate or whatever it might be. I think, and also you get venal business elites as well who are very much on board with mass immigration, precisely because it lowers labor costs. And then you've got political elites which are on board with mass immigration, particularly left-wing political elites, because it gives them a mass clientele class of easy votes on the part of minorities if you can enfranchise them and promise them endless welfare, and you can promise to act on their behalf, and and so it's a sort of combination that what replacement migration. I don't think it's all planned in some room by some cabal, and still less the result of a single guiding intelligence. But what you get is a congruence of interests which converge onto the same space from different starting points. And I think the main ones are sort of neoliberal economic neoliberals on the right who want those cheap labor costs and who want to grow the pie of GDP without really caring too much about communities or GDP per capita and prospect. And they certainly don't care about the idea that the host nation has any say in this sort of thing. And then on the other hand, you have the left-wing political elites which want an unending stream of free votes to prop up their otherwise very unpopular race communist agenda, frankly.
yeah, well, I think that's what we have time for today. Harrison, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I have all the links to your work and to your other shows in the description. So I encourage all of you listening, watching, to go see Harrison's other content at the European Conservative, at the New Culture Forum, as well as his episodes that he's been on at thelotuseaters.com. So, Harrison, thank you.
Connor, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
For everyone watching, please like, share, comment, and subscribe if you liked the content. I will also be doing an episode on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight on Saturday to participate in King Arthur's Day that Nathan Hood's channel is that he put together. So thank you, everyone, and God bless. Bye, everyone.